Well, I want to welcome you to the video here on the Effective Schools movement. As long as I've been alive, books have been written and a lot of money made on defining what a good school does, what good teachers do, what good instructional strategies work, and sometimes it's rather confusing when you see all of the different literature. But in the Effective Schools movement, it is founded in a vast amount of research, and schools that are effective just don't occur naturally. They don't get to the top of the mountain just by falling there, and there's reasons they got there. So let's look at the Effective Schools movement and what it means. In our Trends and Issues class, we're going to reflect upon and evaluate the critical attributes of an effective school. You'll be asked to do that for the school that either you are working in or have taught in. And so let's look at what those are in just a minute. How would you describe an effective school? What makes a school effective? And even how would you define an effective school? Think about that for a moment. Do you have a good answer? Well, the effective school movement defined itself as looking for those schools where all students learn the intended curriculum, where every student was achieving up to their level. The effective school movement looked all over the nation for those types of schools where its kids were being successful in learning what they said they were going to teach. And so how did it get there? Well, if you look at the research movements over the last 80 years, in the 40s and 60s, a lot of the research, about 10,000 studies, looked at personality traits of teachers. What was a teacher supposed to be like? How did these traits, did an extrovert or an introvert affect student learning more than others? And not much came from that. And out of the last movement, you're going to find that there were 4 items that had to do with dispositions that affected student learning. That was enthusiasm, warmth, empathy, and the knowledge of the subject area. But in this round of research, not much was found. In the second round, in the 60s and 70s, it focused on how teachers taught, on the methodology. And here they came up with some vague notions, nothing really with high correlations. They did find that certain methods led to higher student satisfaction or higher teacher satisfaction, maybe had a difference in classroom management, but nothing pervasive came out of that would say there is one method, golden method, that led teachers to be exceptional. And so the third phase then centered on, in the 70s all the way to the 2000s and still going on, are the school variables and the student backgrounds that would correlate. Were there certain things a school could do to make students achieve, all students achieve? And in the first round, in the early 70s, or late 60s and early 70s, the research, and we'll talk about that in a minute, found that schools made really no difference. And this led to the second phase of looking at schools, and they did find, in retaliation to schools made no difference, there were certain correlates, certain conditions that a school had that would make a difference where all kids were learning the intended curriculum. And this was called the Effective Schools movement, which we're going to look at. And then the last phase, today, our books and our speakers are looking at specific student interactions between a teacher and a student. What does the teacher do that's connected to higher student achievement? And Our big example there, usually in the early rounds, was Marzano. So these research conditions sort of set the stage for the effective schools movement. And the biggest stage was set when James Coleman in 1966 through the State Department did the largest social science study done in the American school. It involved 600,000 students. There were 60,000 teachers interviewed in 4,000 schools. Large study, a correlation study, and the ultimate finding basically boiled down to the American school made little difference in student achievement. The single determining factor of a child succeeding in the American school was the family's socioeconomic status. It was where the kid came from. And that didn't sit well with teachers, with administrators, with educators. And so there were a group of researchers. Ron Edmonds was the first, followed by William Brookover and John Goodlad, who studied, again, different variables of the American school. And so they came up in the early round with 5 correlates. They called them correlates, conditions that had specific things involved in setting those conditions that led to schools where almost all its kids were achieving. And so it was decades of research. The first 5 were the positive school climates, the high expectations, the emphasis on academics, the frequent monitoring, and the strong instructional leadership. And then in the 2000s, Larry Lizotte and others came up with the opportunity to learn, and time on task, and positive school relations. And so see, these 7 today form the effective schools movement, and you'll see them especially in Kansas, Missouri, maybe not termed like this, but in its accreditation systems. So that's the effective schools movement. And what we're going to ask you to do in Trends and Issues is to rate your school based on these 7 items and the conditions that come underneath them. See how effective your school might be by your observations. So use that in one of the activities. Well, the first one that the effective schools movement looked at was the positive school climate. And here they define this as a climate that evolved from commonly agreed upon beliefs and it's characterized as being safe, orderly, businesslike, and conducive to learning and free from harm. In fact, the overriding factor here is when a parent sends their child to school, they expect the child to come back better off than they sent him, not psychologically damaged or physically damaged. They expected the schools to be safe havens for their children. But also involved in that was certain conditions. For example, in these schools where all kids were learning in intended curriculum, they had a written philosophy and a set of belief systems, and we're going to look at those later. But you had a staff that really believed in the mission and the exit outcomes. And they were safe, and it was very orderly. There were policies and procedures for everything. That it was run very business-like. There was a climate, and it was measured quite often in the accreditation system where they asked faculty in surveys to give feedback on the climate. They asked the parents and as well as the students, and they tried to set certain conditions in the climate where it was a good place to be, where students wanted to come to school, where parents were frequently in the schools. And so it was a place where teachers and students and parents took pride in what they had. And the building was well maintained. It didn't have to be a brand new building, but if, let's say, a window was broken, it was fixed the next day. When something was written on the bathroom stall, it was taken off that day, because the more they found in this research is that the more you took care of your environment, the more kids would not vandalize it. And so it was usually clean and well maintained. And then there was a spirit of camaraderie, of cooperation among staff. It wasn't highly competitive. Their belief was we need to work together to improve, and that we're always in a process of becoming, that we're never going to finally get to the finish line unless we just keep improving. So this climate was pervasive throughout the staff and was fostered by the principal and school leaders. You're going to look at later on about a belief system, and we'll see if you would fit into an effective school belief system by checking off those things that you really believe about teaching and about your job and role of working with children. Well, the positive school climate had certain beliefs, and we'll just talk about those in a minute. We have another video on that later on, but your staff really did believe that every kid in front of them was going to learn the curriculum, and they're going to learn it well given time. It may not click the first time, so you've got apparatuses, you've got a system where they are given a second and a third chance to learn it. For those children that were identified, their curriculum was modified so that they again were expected to meet what they said in the IEP was going to be their goal. But every kid was going to learn and learn well given time. And then they also believed that it was what the teacher did, not the student, that predicted how they would do in class. The greatest single predictor of a student behavior is what the teacher does. And then it wasn't the outside factors. It wasn't the socioeconomic status of the child. Though they impinge upon learning, it was actually the teachers that caused students to learn. And then third, they look for systems where you built on success, that you started and scaffolded the learning so that success bred success in the instructional apparatus. They also looked at what they were teaching and how, not so much filling a kid's head with facts and figures, memorizing things, but it was how to get them to think, how to know how to learn, how to solve problems, and to think critically, because you have such an information system at your disposal with a phone right in your pocket. Almost all the world's knowledge base is found in your pocket on a phone. So it's not so much having to memorize things, it was how you're going to use that information to solve problems and to live a good life. They also looked at the outcomes and how you're going to teach them, what determined what was going to teach. And so they clearly defined in a scope and sequence of curriculum from kindergarten to 12th grade exactly what they wanted their kids to know, be able to do, and to believe. Those three areas: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. And then they believed that learning is a matter of time, that certain kids in certain subjects just don't get it as quickly as others, and so it wasn't one size fits all type of instruction. It was where kids were given multiple chances and in multiple ways to learn how to meet those outcomes that the school had set. They also believed that learning was a matter of style, that certain kids learned in different ways, and so teachers were trained in teaching to the multiple intelligences, to the different styles of learning. And then finally, that they believed that every kid could learn, that there were high expectations that had very certain characteristics, even in the way you ask questions, that would lead to certain student achievement. So this climate was a belief system in its staff, from the janitor all the way up to the superintendent. It was commonly held. Well, kids may not see always the positive school climate as they go to go back and forth to school, but thought this was a good cartoon to just add. Well, the second correlate was strong instructional leadership, and this usually came from the principal, and he was the ringleader. He gave the direction, the emphasis, and the support that schools needed to become effective. He was there for his staff, but he was also there to set the way. He was knowledgeable in curriculum and teaching. He was usually an exceptional teacher. We found that many of the real leaders in schools where all kids were learning knew what was being taught. They had worked in curriculum. They were excellent teachers themselves. And they got out into the classroom. They had frequent classroom observations. We call them walkthroughs, where they simply came through your classroom, stayed a couple of minutes, and then put a nice note in your box, after they had visited. But they knew what was going on because they didn't just hide themselves in the office. They were out in the schools. And then there was a system of ongoing staff development. It wasn't where the principal had gone to a real neat speaker at a conference and then brought that speaker back. It was based on the direction that the school wanted to take and what they needed to know to get there. And so it was a staff-based staff development and school-based, not so much county-based or district-based. And then they looked at how to use their time, the materials, the personnel to enhance academic performance. There was a restructuring of time, of the types of things that they use, like textbooks, and a lot of movement was away from the textbook. And then there was a good working relationship between the school and the community from the instructional leader. He was out in the community, and a lot of times he would try to protect his teachers from different comments coming from the community, because he was a very visual person in the community. So strong instructional leadership and was a strong part of the movement. In fact, I argued in the doctoral school that I didn't believe in this one, because I thought great teachers could overcome a weak instructional leader. And I remember my professor said, "Then find me a school where that's occurring." And it's hard to find that. If you don't have a strong instructional leader as a principal, a lot of times the school can't get where it's going to want to go. The third element was high expectations. This was a climate of expectations by staffs that reflects a belief that all the kids are going to learn, and the staff has a belief that they can do that. They have the capability to help every student learn. And so the bar was kind of set high, that the performance expectations were high, that the teachers believed that these expectations could be fulfilled, and they were written, they were understood by staff and even parents. This is what's going to happen. You got to know this to leave this class with an OBE type of curriculum. And then they were taught and trained through various programs to have those behaviors that convey high expectations. And we're going to look at those in just a minute in a brief scenario. But there was also a system for rewarding and celebrating achievement, because as you reach these goals, it's important to celebrate when goals are reached. Success breeds success, and so as we reach the outcomes that we set at different curriculums at different levels, then we celebrated those, and there was rewards for that. So there was high expectations. And what Brophy and Good found, and later in current teaching practice, we talk about this in much more detail, but every teacher comes to a classroom with some biases, whether or not they admit it or not, based on the gender of the student, socioeconomic status of the student, how neat they write or how neat they look. A lot of times it is race based. Behavior is a bias that many teachers have, or how you've grouped them, or who they hang around with, the way they talk, the seating position in the class. We saw some pretty neat research on where kids sit and how their grades are reflected. And then simple things like the lounge talk actually led to quite a lot of bias in teachers, and as well as permanent records. So there were these high expectations were affected by sources of bias, and as teachers were made aware of this, things began to change. Because Brophy and Good said that there was a Pygmalion effect, that teachers sort of expect certain behaviors from particular students based on these biases, and because of these different expectations, teachers behave differently towards your students, towards specific students. And so this behavior non-verbally over a period of time would tell the student what behaviors were expected of them, what level of achievement was expected of them, and so they began to act that way, and it did affect the way they saw themselves, how they achieved, and how they were motivated to do well in that class. And so basically, if the treatment was consistent over a long period of time, the student became what the teacher expected of them. High expectation students would achieve at high levels, while low expected students would decline. And so it was what we called the Pygmalion effect, and it was prevalent in quite a lot of schools. And maybe if you look at yourself, sometimes you might have done that to children. Well, some of the little things, real quickly, that we communicate high expectations to every child. One of them has to do with how you ask questions, that you make a constant and conscientious effort to call on every child. That is, not leaving out a child simply because you think he can't answer the question. But there was equal distribution of questions. There was an equal distribution of wait time, allowing at least 5 seconds for each child. We found that a lot of times you would wait the 5 seconds for one you thought was a high achieving child and not give the low achieving child but 1 or 2 seconds before you went on to another student. We found that the level of questions had an effect and an influence on student achievement, but giving all students the opportunity to answer higher level thinking questions, even the students that weren't achieving, to get them to synthesize, to analyze, to evaluate certain questions. The rephrasing and clue giving, giving answers, delving for the answers from each student when the answer was hesitant or correct. A lot of times, if low achieving students, you moved on to a high achieving student if he was hesitant. But here you wanted to keep on the student till they got the question right. The positive feedback, giving sincere praise to all students who struggle for an answer. And that was a neat training episode in several books on how you do that. And then where kids sat, we tend to find low achieving students that in certain places, high achieving and others, so seating was varied. And then personal contact as they enter the room or exit the room, where you give equal attention to every student with eye contact, smiles, and gesturing. And then showing a personal interest in every kid, not just the kid if you're a coach, who your athletes were, but you also show the interest to the skateboard kid, to the band kid, to all the kids that come into your classroom. And then the sensitivity to emotional needs, the awareness and adjusting to a kid's emotional state and needs. All of these were kind of involved in ways of communicating high expectations to every kid. This little cartoon is probably true of my art class when I was in elementary school. Wasn't a real good artist when I was in school. So emphasis, so the third one was high expectations, and now the next one is emphasis on academics. In these schools, there was a school-wide emphasis that learning is the primary purpose of the school, and that student achievement takes priority over other activities. Here you had schools that had worked on, they didn't just buy a curriculum, they worked on it themselves, where there was a scope and sequence, and that means that it was organized from kindergarten to 12th grade. There was a sequence from the scope of kindergarten to 12th grade, a sequence of curriculum in your discipline areas that kids were expected to master to be able to graduate from that school. And here you had a staff that believed that their responsibility was to teach that curriculum, not just what they wanted to teach, but what the curriculum was, and that these teaching activities were aligned with the curriculum. There was an alignment to the teaching to the outcomes. And then the school policies, the organization of the structure of the school reflected the curriculum, and there were staff meetings, and much of the staff meetings, staff work was to increase student achievements, especially for certain groups, age levels, or specific students. So the emphasis was not on winning basketball trophies, but it was to teach every kid the intended curriculum. And then there was frequent monitoring. That is, the school had frequent ways to test whether or not their kids were reaching performance, to doing what we said they were going to learn. They also looked at staff performance and program effectiveness, what was working, what was not. And so you had an assessment system that was aligned with the curriculum and the instruction. It wasn't a norm reference test that asked, general things that maybe weren't even taught in the curriculum, and then you gauge it to how the other kids in the nation react to it. It was very specific. They were very focused tests on exactly what they were learning, and if a kid wasn't learning it, they went back and taught it. They were used for diagnostic and remedial purposes. That's why they were criteria-based reference tests. And grading and promotion were related to mastery. That is, a kid did not go on until he could show he could meet the outcomes. And that was kind of important and hard to do in many schools. Because you wanted, so far, in most of your schools, they were age-based. That's why you had third grade or certain levels. But so much your promotion was not based upon your age. It was based upon what you knew, what you related, what you knew how to do. And so they used these assessments to see how things were going and to modify their curriculum or the instruction if it needed to be. So there was, again, frequent monitoring. It wasn't that you were testing all the time. They were sometimes just short tests, semester tests to see how kids were coming along in the curriculum. And then the last two that were added later on in the late 1990s and early 2000 was the time on task. We found that schools were not spending all their time engaging students in the curriculum. And so here, schools that were allotting significant classroom time to engage students in what they said they were going to learn were higher probability students were achieving. And what they found in the early studies in the early 1900s, when they looked at the estimated use of school time in a school day, there were usually 1,080 hours in a school day, which meant taking out lunchtime and so forth, about 6 hours a day. And the attendance time, when you looked at how kids attended, some days you got sick, sometimes you had a snow day, you were very seldom perfect, but you were about 5.4 to 6 hours a day, and it averaged about 900. You were down to 970 hours in the school year when you actually looked at how much time a kid was in school. And then the allocated time to a class or student learning, because you have a lot of different like assemblies in the secondary school and things that really were not on the intended curriculum, you were down to 4.75 hours a day, and that knocked it down for a year, 855. When you looked at instructional time then in your classroom, just because they were in your classroom didn't mean they were on task with what they were supposed to be learning on the scope and sequence of curriculum. So there you found great differences in schools. The instructional time being from 2 hours to 4 hours, and when you looked at the year, that was like 360 hours to 720. I mean, there was a vast gap between schools that were effectively using their time on task and those that were not. And then when you looked at engaged time, that is where actually a kid was listening to you and really engaged in the study, you were down to an hour and a half average, from 270 to 430 hours a year. Big difference in giving a kid 6 hours. So it wasn't so much the amount of time you had in the kid's schedule in class, it was the engaged time, and then were they learning what you said they were going to learn, the intended curriculum. And a lot of times it was only a half an hour to an hour and a half a day when it was the scope and sequence of the curriculum that was being taught. It's where it was 100 hours to 270 hours in the entire year. And so it wasn't so much how much time you spent in school, it was how you spent that time in school. So that was a big restructuring effort in the effective schools, how you use your time. And we saw some different ways of structuring school time coming out of that. And then the last one was homeschool relations, where parents supported the school. Parents are a key part in effective schools. They found that parents that really do basically support the school mission, and they are given the opportunity to play a role in helping that mission, they had more buy-in. And so schools made in the 1900s and 2000s a bigger effort to involve parents and to get parents to know what was going on in the classroom. You got Facebook pages, internet pages, blogs. You had homework hotlines. You had different grading systems that were automated when a kid didn't turn in a paper. Parents were notified. You had some schools with their own TV station would broadcast the debates, the football games. The Board of Education broadcast. When I was on a board in 250, we got to initiate, when I was president, in fact, the board had its first TV broadcast, and it really did change the way board members talked. A lot of things moved to executive session, but all these were ways of opening up school communication to parents. And then there were ways in the classroom to communicate to parents, putting a telephone, and much of this was for safety reasons, especially now that you have cell phones. You had weekly class newsletters or blogs. You had parent visitation days. You had bragging postcards, which we talk about later in current teacher practices. So you had all kinds of different ways to communicate with parents from an individual classroom. And then you had different ways of coming out of the effective schools movement to share instruction with homework backpacks in the elementary school, joint homeschool projects. You had parents coming in to teach certain things. So the homeschool relations made a difference where every kid was learning curriculum. So basically the question was, what was and is an effective school? And so the effective schools movement research found that there was a high correlation between these 7 items for an effective school. Hope that helps you define your school, and we'll see you in the next video.